what happens is we roll forward to the next few years, and between 1870 and 1875, Congress passed a bunch of civil rights laws. In 1876, Democrats took control of the House of Representatives. In 1892, Democrats got control of the House and the Senate and the presidency and promptly repealed all the civil rights laws, voting rights laws, etc. That's where the South started literacy tests, poll taxes, Democrat legislatures passing all these things to keep blacks from voting, despite the fact that the 15th Amendment says they can vote.
The Civil Rights Act of 1875 banned discrimination in public accommodations and much of what became the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But unfortunately, it was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1883.
And the Democrats in power in the South enacted all the Jim Crow laws and simply disenfranchised the blacks. And tremendous gains had been made in the years after the Civil War. Those were all lost, they were all reversed, and basically what you had was African Americans in the South going back into a virtual condition of slavery.
There was no more civil rights legislation until 1957. The Democrats had succeeded in preventing civil rights legislation for nearly a century. But in 1957, the Eisenhower administration wrote the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Senator Everett Dirksen followed that up with the 1960 Civil Rights Act. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was again a continuation of what the Republican Party had already done. The hero of passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was Republican Senator Everett Dirksen. He was the one who outmaneuvered the Democrats who had been filibustering against it and led to its passage. So not to LBJ should go the credit for passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Democrats in Congress, only 62% of Democrats voted for those two bills, 83% of Republicans did so.
A bright chapter in the course of human events was written with the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. It was an historic occasion that Lincoln's dream of equality came to fruition at the White House as President Johnson signed it into law just a few hours after the House had approved the measure. Before a distinguished audience of legislators and civil rights leaders, President Johnson affixes his signature using more than 100 pens. One of the coveted souvenirs goes to the Nobel Prize winner Martin Luther King, a dedicated leader of his race.
Martin Luther King had caught the imagination of the country, and the civil rights movement, which had been going on for 100 years and had been led by the NAACP and courageous litigation throughout the South and elsewhere, was well underway. But from 55 December for a whole year, and then for a decade, you had a season of civil disobedience, of nonviolent direct action of Martin Luther King, so that by the 1960 election, it was a crucial issue.
We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. We have a right to expect that the Negro community will be responsible, will uphold the law, but they have a right to expect that the law will be fair, that the Constitution will be colorblind, as Justice Harlan said at the turn of the century.
So when he got me to join his Senate staff, it was to be a foreign policy speechmaker, writer. And he, meanwhile, had been learning he was in trouble with the Negro vote. He had voted for the jury trial amendment on the Civil Rights Act of 57, and that was anathema to the NAACP and the civil rights movement. So he had that obstacle, and he had no close ties. And so he was learning that from Democratic states like Michigan that he was in trouble with the black vote. And someone told him I knew King and had been involved in civil rights. And so one day Kennedy on the Georgetown Street was driving up to the Senate, and I was standing on the sidewalk, and he had his convertible and stopped, and I got in his, I think, a red convertible, and very impatiently while driving, tapping on the window, he said, "All right, I understand you know about Negroes and civil rights. In 10 minutes on the way up to the Hill, tell me what I ought to do as president to clean up this damn civil rights mess."
The civil rights mess had been brewing for decades, and the hopes that the Civil War had solved it were destroyed as Southern Democrats opposed every piece of civil rights legislation ever introduced in Congress. Even Senator Kennedy received pressure from his own party not to support the Reverend Martin Luther King. He was faced with a dilemma that his own party had created.